Alright, so I'm going to be talking about Andrew Jackson's presidency. So, Andrew Jackson in 1824 faced off against President John Quincy Adams, who Adams eventually ran. They both engaged in a process called mudslinging, where they said a whole bunch of things about the opponent that actually none of it was true, or at least almost everything said was untrue. So about Adams, they said that he was a drunk and liked to gamble, that he even spent public money on a gambling table for the White House, whereas he did actually buy a gambling table for the White House. He spent his own money on it. One thing that wasn't actually known, but that was actually people would have found crazy at the time, was that he was a bit of a nudist in that he swam nude in public, in a public lake. So, again, he liked to swim nude in a public lake. Jackson was the favorite of the common people, but he wasn't well born, meaning that he wasn't of rich blood. He was more of a self-made man and well liked by the common people. He also wasn't initially educated. There was an old saying that said that whereas Adams could write, that Jackson could fight. Meaning that John Quincy Adams was well educated, whereas Andrew Jackson was good at fighting and warfare. So his wife and mother were also targets of the slander for Andrew Jackson. So in other words, people like to talk about Adams. People like to talk about Jackson's wife and mother. They would say all kinds of ridiculous things, like for example that Andrew Jackson's wife was still married to her first husband when she got married to Andrew Jackson. However, that wasn't true. So, moving on to point 2, Jackson's inauguration. During his initial run for presidency, as I said, in 1824, he wasn't elected president, even though he had the majority of the popular votes and even the majority of the electoral votes. But he didn't have enough to win. Instead, he came up short, and so the government at the time, which was mostly people who favored Adams, was able to place Adams in the presidency. However, in the election of 1828, Jackson ran against him again and was able to win. Not only was he able to win, but as we'll discuss later on, there were some other things that happened. So, it was a record history of voters. People who had never voted before came out to vote. Common people had previously not been allowed to vote before that time, but they were allowed to. It was said that maybe about around 10,000 people came out to vote. So much so that a riot actually broke out, and Andrew Jackson had to kind of sneak out a back door before he ended up almost getting pressed to death, initially crushed by the crowd. Now, well-born people pointed to this incident and said that that's why they didn't believe that common people should be able to rule the government, because it would essentially be like mob rule, where people just go crazy and lose their mind. Point number 3 is from the frontier to the White House. So essentially, like I said earlier, he grew up on the frontier. His father died before he was even born. He loved sports and had a hot temper. In other words, even though he was well liked and he was popular, he liked sports, things like that, he also lost his temper, got angry quite easily. During the Revolution, he enlisted at age 13, was captured, but taunted a soldier when the soldier told him to shine his boots. he told the soldier that essentially, I'm a prisoner of war and I deserve to be treated as such, meaning basically, I am a prisoner of war, not your slave, so you can shine your own boots. That's paraphrasing, meaning that I put that in my own words. So he didn't actually say that, but that's basically what he said. So he also, after the war, when he was released by the British, so he taunted the soldier, was cut because of it, had a scar which he ended up boasting about later on. After the war, he became a lawyer, though he never really learned law, but he got into a lot of mischief, meaning that he was getting drunk, getting into fights, things like that. So, however, he was able to get really wealthy off of it. As the territory of America grew, also his law practice grew. And he was able to buy land and slaves and become a plantation owner as well. So he was a slave owner. This led to his temper getting in the way also, with a man by the name of Charles Dickinson, who was a slave trader. So he had this dispute with this guy, Charles Dickinson, and challenged him to a duel. Well, Dickinson was said to, at the time, be one of the best shooters ever. However, he didn't care because he liked to fight and he was a hothead. So, in the duel, which was a showdown between two gentlemen where they would shoot at each other after walking a certain number of steps. So initially, Dickinson shot him, and it was the shot, because he was the first to shoot, since he was the quickest draw, and was so close to Jackson's heart that they actually never were able to get the bullet out. However, after Dickinson shot him, Andrew Jackson was essentially able to shoot him back, and Charles Dickinson dropped dead as soon as he got shot. So, they get in the duel. Dickinson shoots Jackson. They get in the duel. Dickinson shoots Jackson, but then doesn't kill him, and Jackson shoots back, killing Dickinson, and saying that even if he had actually got shot in the heart, he still would have shot him and won, because that's the type of person that he was. The people is the next point. So, essentially, he was able to win over the people because he was in both the House and the Senate in the government. So, after being a lawyer, he then transitioned into government, became a member of the House and the Senate, and then in the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812 is where he really became famous. And so going back to his political run and the comparison between 1824 and 1828, he spent those 4 years becoming a better politician. So Adams had named a man by the name of Henry Clay his vice president when he was in office. And so they kind of worked against Jackson. But during this time, Jackson created actually a different political party, which was known then as the Democratic Party. And that led to the Democratic Party that we have nowadays. And this party was actually seen as more of a party for the people versus the party of the rich and famous, which was what the Republican Party had become. So, Jackson's government at the time, he ran kind of similar to how he ran the army, since he was an army general. which was frowned upon by a lot of the other people in the government. And the people that he had in the government weren't very well liked. They weren't the usual people that would be there. And he met with them actually in the White House kitchen, which is why they were called a kitchen cabinet. He also ran what was referred to by the people opposing him as the spoils system, as in the old saying, to the victor goes the spoils of war. But basically what it was is he got rid of anyone who he didn't think should be in office as soon as he got into office and replaced them with his political allies. He also did a lot of good by doing that because a lot of the people in office at the time were really corrupt. Like, for example, one person was essentially stealing money from the government, but since they were lifetime positions, people really didn't like the fact that he was getting rid of people. So instead of being lifetime, he instead created it to where it would be revolving, so they would serve short terms instead of lifetime. And then after their term, they would go back to working regular jobs. And he felt that this was more in line with a democracy because it gave the people a chance to serve their government. He was also more of a patriot than anything else, even more so than he was a politician. The reason being is that one person he had initially kicked out of office started to unbutton his shirt to show Jackson his wounds from the war, and Jackson told him to keep his shirt on and hired him back on. So, point number 8, the nullification crisis. So Jackson, once again, with the people in mind, he placed tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods, but these tariffs favored more of the northern factories over the southern plantations. So his vice president, John Calhoun, actually had a sympathetic heart for the southern plantation owners, and so thus supported their protests on these tariffs. So what this led to was places like South Carolina who were basically boycotting essentially these tariffs. Now, Jackson initially lowered the tariffs to make them less expensive. However, it wasn't enough to appease or to make South Carolina back down. And they threatened to actually pull out of the Union if it didn't change. And it caused tensions to rise. This led to what was called nullification, where individual states could petition the government to get rid of any bills that they felt were unconstitutional. Now, eventually, what ended up happening is that Jackson, who, like I said before, was really hot-headed, said that he was going to not only send soldiers to enforce the law, but also that he would personally see to hanging the first person he saw in South Carolina when visiting there that disobeyed this and didn't pay the tariffs. Alright, so the next point is the battle with the banks. The bank president at the time was Nicholas Biddle, who Jackson didn't quite agree with. He thought he was really corrupt. The banks were ran by the federal government, which, if you remember, was pretty much made up of people who are wealthy, from wealthy families, well educated. Jackson believed more in the smaller state banks, and that they should be able to have a fair go at running the bank system. So this kind of set up a clash between bankers versus farmers. in that the bankers didn't want these banks to close because they relied on them for things like loans and stuff like that, but the farmers did. So initially what happened was the politicians that were opposing Jackson thought, well, if he passes this, he's done for because the bankers won't vote for him, but if he doesn't pass it, then the farmers won't vote for him. So he went ahead and went on the side of the farmers. What they didn't think about was the fact that there was a lot more farmers than there were bankers and other wealthy people. What he decided to do was to try to starve it out, which again, back to his military style of running things, was he basically pulled all of the finances out of the federal banks and put them in smaller state banks that were ran by people who he was friends with. Now his enemies began to call these pet banks. So that is his battle with the banks. Now, he was proud of it because he felt he solved a great problem. The final policy is his Indian policy. Now, he didn't like Native Americans. He thought that they were a problem, the white man's problem. Native Americans called him by the name of Sharp Knife because essentially he didn't care about them and he was quick to violence with them. However, there were about 5 tribes that did try and be civilized according to the white man's standard, just like we were learning about in the video that we watched, The White Man's Image. However, it didn't work out so well for them because even though they did things like created their own newspaper, dressed the way that the white man dressed, stuff like that, they still were hated by a lot of America and the settlers, and eventually they wanted them gone, especially those who sought to use their land for their own selfish gains. So Jackson was able to get the government to pass an Indian Removal Act. However, this was for trade of their current land to land that was on the Great Plains. However, the government didn't put in the law that they were to be forced off their land, and so a lot of Native Americans had a disagreement with it and didn't move. However, Jackson, once again, because he was hot-headed and didn't like the Native Americans and thought they were a problem, sent soldiers to forcibly remove them. So there was a Native American by the name of Black Hawk, who was a chief of his tribe, who fought and eventually had his soldiers massacred by Jackson's army, which ended in 1832. Now, the remaining soldiers of the Native Americans were led away in chains. However, Black Hawk still claimed that he wasn't ashamed of what he had done because he believed he was protecting the women and children, and that it should really be the white men that should be ashamed of their actions because they had constantly lied and cheated the Native Americans and caused war. When the Native Americans, by their trying to be quote unquote civilized like the white men wanted, that the Native Americans had tried to be peaceful in their actions. Now, this eventually led to what was called the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Creek Indians, or Native Americans, were displaced from their land, meaning that they were kicked off their ancestral land, the land that they had lived on for years, for centuries, decades. And then the president that took over 2 years after Jackson's presidency, Martin Van Buren, had displaced about 17,000 Cherokee Indians. Now, along this march past the Mississippi, many of these Native Americans died, which that's why later on it was called referred to as the Trail of Tears, because they were forced off their homeland and essentially killed because they were forced off by violence. A lot of them got sick along the way and weren't treated very well along the journey. Also, the term tribe is a white man term for Native American groups. It is not originally their term. Now, many of these Native Americans would escape from this march and would hide in the Florida swamps, and still can be, some of them still live there today, well, at least their ancestors. This was considered Jackson's solution to the Native American problem, which even after, when different people felt a lot of shame towards what happened, Jackson didn't. He felt he had solved the Native American problem. So that's essentially Jackson's presidency, both the good and the bad, in a nutshell.